I think the fundamental kind of context of scenario planning is it's based on this notion of variable or plausible futures. And what we want to do in the scenario planning is tease out some examples of what would be on that continuum of possible futures or plausible futures. Okay? So the point is not to say this is the future that's going to happen. Our investigation in the think tank is to think about what that range of plausible futures could be and to understand what the implications might be, where and when the consequences would occur, what the impacts would be, and so on. We're facing a series of very complex and complicated issues, and scenario planning allows us to think about how they may combine. So for example, you can think about macro trends, which we'll talk about today in terms of, say, global population, climate change, advances in technology. How do those things interrelate as we think about different versions of the future? And in terms of where to use scenario planning in a sort of a context of certainty or uncertainty, if you think of this sort of continuum here, which is, well, the vertical one is really about uncertainty. So as you go up, you've got escalating uncertainty. And here we have different styles of planning. So we'd be familiar with forecasting, which is, we see a lot of that. But forecasting as a planning is really done in an environment where there's very high levels of predictability. Or we're just going to assume, for example, that, I don't know, inflation is going to be 2% for the next 10 years and GDP is going to be consistent, and we just telegraph out a forecast for the future. So that's one model of planning. The other model of planning is where, out in this extreme, which is where you have very high levels of uncertainty, very low predictability. That planning mode we sort of call hoping. We're probably not in that, and we're certainly not in this, right? But what the literature and the experience suggests is that scenario planning is very good for when you have certainly some elevated levels of uncertainty, but it's not off the charts, but we have a landscape of uncertainty and we want to be able to think about how the future might unfold. So why conduct the think tank? Well, part of this is an awareness of what could happen helps us to better prepare for what will happen. So I can't tell you exactly what's going to happen, and nor can you tell me what's exactly going to happen. But by going through some of these exercises of thinking about the future, we could think about what could happen, and that's going to better prepare us for what will ultimately unfold. We have an enormous breadth and depth of a topic we want to explore. So we don't want to have a think tank that is a superficial exploration. Now, obviously, we could spend months exploring this topic. But we want to really be able to use this framework to be able to capture and focus your collective intelligence on the subject at hand. So we want to be able to take a really deep dive into the future. And ultimately what we're aiming to do is have a sort of a transformational thinking process. It would be our thrill if you walked out of here with some new views about the future, that if your thinking got expanded. And that'll happen by your interactions with other people in this room. For a considerable portion of this think tank, we're going to think about the future and how it could occur in an objective sense. Okay, so I know there's a lot of people in here who naturally jump to fix the problem or find the solution. So part of what we want to do before we get to that is we want to frame out these plausible scenarios. So that's going to require a willingness to say, whether we like it or not, what would happen if this played out? What would be the consequences and implications? And I think once we understand that canvas, then we can start to think about what might be those priority or target areas, or what are those early indicators we need to be looking at, or where might be the disruptive technologies come to play, and so on. We played the future game, so you had a chance at practicing decision making and consequences. We looked at some of the preliminary survey results from the Future of Midwest Agriculture Survey and the surveys you completed as participants prior. Then we spent the lion's share of the afternoon looking at the major trends and implications that are emerging at a macro scale, and we had a lot of discussion about those. And then we spent some time identifying and ranking key drivers. The bottom axis here, the x-axis is importance. And I've just tightened it a little bit to cover the sort of field of responses. So it goes from 4 to 9, but the response range you had was 1 to 10. Okay, so that's important. So this end out here, these were the ones that were rated as higher relative importance out of the group of 20. The vertical axis is the uncertainty, running from 3 to 8 on that Y scale. What we're ultimately looking for is two macro axes, right, that are going to help us define the plausible scenario spaces. So if you think of this canvas here, we want to think of that as framing what we think are the plausible sets of futures of the Midwest agriculture region as we look out to 2040. And what we've done is we've had a bit of a go at starting to try to define some ends of a continuum. So if you think of each axis as a continuum from one end to the other in both ways, but ultimately what we're coming down to is, say for example, this space here, which is scenario C, we're calling it that. That's a future that's going to unfold based on the combination of these two axes ends, right? Okay? And so scenario D is we're going to speculate about a future that would get created as a combination of these two prevailing conditions. I do actually have a very interesting level of anticipation on this, and I'll tell you why, because I think they are two rather fascinating continuums that are very contemporary, right? And you've got to a depth, and I think they've been articulated in a way that goes beyond where people will get to in a more superficial approach. What would be the predicted size and the nature of the impact? And thinking out 2020, 2030, 2040. We've now framed out, to the large degree considered plausible, okay, with a little bit of moderation on is it really going to happen that big, that fast, okay? But the vast majority of people, and I would say at least 90% of people on each question, said it was plausible, right? So we're in that sort of span of, if that was an election, you'd win, right? So with that in frame, so there's the tent pegs, right? That represents the canvas for the future.